"Sir, can you take me home?" The words stopped him cold. He had one hand on the car door, the other holding a small white pharmacy bag. When the voice reached him, soft, careful, almost apologetic. For a split second, he thought it was part of the night itself. The way the city sometimes whispered when you were too tired to tell the difference between sound and thought. Then he turned. The girl stood beneath the flickering awning of the all-night pharmacy. Rain slid off the metal edge above her in thin, steady lines. She was small, so small that the oversized hood of her jacket swallowed most of her head. Her sneakers were worn, the toes darkened with old stains, and both of her hands were wrapped tightly around a plastic bag with a red pharmacy logo stretched across it. "I'm sorry," she said when he didn't answer right away. Her voice wavered just a little now. "I didn't mean to scare you." He straightened, instinctively creating space, the way he did in boardrooms when negotiations turned uncertain. "You shouldn't talk to strangers," he said, automatically. "I know," she replied. Then after a brief pause, "But I don't know what else to do." That answer unsettled him more than fear would have. "What's your name?" he asked. She swallowed, then lifted her chin as if saying it out loud required courage. "My name's Annie. I'm 6. 6. The word echoed in his head, colliding with the time glowing on his car dashboard. 2:47 a.m. "I got lost," Annie continued, as if sensing she needed to explain everything before he decided to walk away. "I went to buy medicine for my grandma. The store near our building was closed, so I walked to this one. But when I came out," she glanced over her shoulder at the dark street. "Everything looks different at night." He followed her gaze. The block was nearly empty. Streetlights spaced too far apart. Shadows pooling where sidewalks cracked and dipped. He'd driven through this area countless times without noticing any of it. "Where is your grandma now?" he asked. "At home. In bed." Annie hugged the bag closer. "She's sick. Her chest hurts when she breathes, and she coughs a lot. The medicine helps her sleep." He felt a flicker of something uncomfortable recognition, maybe. He'd bought his own medicine for headaches that refused to go away, for nights that stretched too long. He'd never once wondered who might be standing outside afterward, with more urgent reasons. "Why didn't you call someone?" he asked. "We don't have a car," Annie said, "and my grandma's phone doesn't work very good. Sometimes it just stops." He glanced around again. Slower this time, more deliberately. No parents rushing in. No older sibling hovering nearby. Just a child, a bag of medicine, and a city that had already decided it was done caring for the night. "I can call the police," he said carefully. Annie shook her head so fast her hood slipped back. "Please don't. They ask too many questions. My grandma gets scared when people ask questions." That was not a fear a 6-year-old invented on her own. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the rain and the faint hum of the pharmacy's neon sign. He could feel the familiar calculations rising in his mind. Risk, liability, headlines, consequences. He had built an empire by listening to those calculations. They had never failed him. And yet, "Sir," Annie said again, quieter now, "I don't need much. Just a ride. I know it's not good to ask, but my grandma's waiting, and I don't know how to get back." "A ride?" he repeated. She nodded. "In your car. Just to our building. I can show you. It's near the old playground, the one with the broken swings." He knew exactly which playground she meant. He'd approved a redevelopment proposal for that block years ago. It had stalled. Budget issues. Priorities elsewhere. "I can't just put you in my car," he said, though the words felt weaker than they should have. "I'll sit in the back," Annie offered quickly. "I won't touch anything. I promise. I just need to get home." "We go." He studied her face, searching for something: panic, manipulation, anything that would make this easier to categorize. There was none, just exhaustion and a kind of stubborn hope that adults were supposed to be able to handle things. "You're very brave," he said before he could stop himself. Annie shrugged. "My grandma says I have to be. She says the world doesn't slow down just because you're small." That hit harder than any plea. He looked down at his car, sleek and expensive, built for comfort and distance. Then he looked back at Annie, standing in damp sneakers under a failing light, holding medicine like it was the most valuable thing she owned. In his mind, a voice whispered, "This is how trouble starts." Another voice, quieter, older, answered, "This is how you decide who you are." "All right," he said slowly. "We'll do this the safe way. You sit in the back seat. I keep the doors unlocked, and you tell me where to go. If anything feels wrong, we stop immediately. Do you understand?" Annie's eyes widened, not with excitement, but with relief so sudden it nearly undid him. "Yes, sir. I understand." He unlocked the car and stepped back, giving her space. She opened the rear door carefully, climbed in, and folded her hands in her lap exactly as promised, the pharmacy bag resting on top like a fragile offering. As he got behind the wheel, the interior lights dimmed, and the rain traced slow lines down the windshield. He hesitated with his hand on the ignition. This was not a favor he could forget tomorrow. He knew that now. "Which way, Annie?" he asked. She leaned forward slightly. "Left," she said. "And thank you. My grandma will be really relieved." He started the engine. The car pulled away from the pharmacy, leaving behind the bright lights and the illusion that help was always close by. Ahead of them, the street narrowed, darker and quieter, leading into a part of the city he'd always passed through but never entered. At 2:47 a.m., with a lost 6-year-old in his back seat and medicine meant to keep someone alive through the night, he realized something irreversible had begun. Not just a ride home, a reckoning. The car moved slowly at first, easing away from the pharmacy and into the narrow street beyond. The windshield wipers whispered back and forth, clearing thin arcs through the rain. Inside the cabin, it was warm and quiet in a way that felt almost intrusive, like a private room neither of them had planned to share. Annie sat exactly as she'd promised, small hands folded in her lap, the pharmacy bag resting on top. She watched the passing streetlights with serious attention, as if memorizing each one. "You said left," the man said, breaking the silence. "Yes, sir. Here." She pointed, careful not to lean too far forward. He signaled and turned. The road narrowed immediately, the kind of street designed decades ago and never updated, patched and repatched until it felt more like a suggestion than a plan. Row houses pressed close together, their brick faces darkened by age and rain. Most windows were black, but here and there a single light glowed, muted and tired, like someone had fallen asleep without turning it off. "How often do you walk this far?" he asked. "Not usually," Annie said. "Only when we have to." "When do you have to?" "When my grandma runs out of medicine," she replied. There was no complaint in her voice, no drama, just a fact, stated plainly. The way adults talked about bills or weather. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "And that happens? A lot?" "Sometimes," she thought for a moment. "More in the winter. The cold makes her chest worse." He nodded, though she couldn't see him. Winter. Cold. He thought of the climate-controlled buildings he moved through every day. The way temperature had become another variable he never needed to worry about. Somewhere along the way, comfort had stopped feeling like a privilege and started feeling like a right. "What does your grandma's name mean?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. "Her name is Ruth," Annie said. "She says it means loyalty or kindness, one of those." "Those are important things," he said. "She says they're the only things you can't buy back once you lose them." The words settled between them, heavier than a child's words had any right to be. He wondered how many lessons Annie had absorbed simply by listening, by watching adults struggle and fail quietly. They drove on for another block. The rain thickened, blurring the edges of the street, softening everything into gray and amber. He slowed as they approached an intersection where one of the streetlights had burned out completely, leaving a pocket of darkness that swallowed the corner. "Straight," Annie said. Then right after the tall building, "The one with the fire escape?" he asked. "Yes." He followed her directions easily now. Once you learn to see a place, truly see it, the layout revealed itself. He noticed things he'd never noticed before. The uneven sidewalks, the missing curb cuts, the way trash cans overflowed on one side of the street, but not the other. These were not accidents. They were decisions, made slowly, invisibly, over time. "How old is your grandma?" he asked. 68, Annie said. "She says that's not old, but she also says her body disagrees." He smiled despite himself. "She sounds wise. I think she is. She worked a lot before she got sick, cleaning houses, sometimes offices." He pictured her then, moving through other people's spaces, making them livable, while her own world shrank smaller and more fragile. He knew those offices. Some of them belonged to companies he'd acquired, restructured, renamed. The car stopped at a red light that seemed unnecessary at this hour. No cross traffic, no pedestrians, just the rule of it, unyielding. "Does anyone else help you?" he asked gently. "With what?" "With everything," he said, aware of how vague that sounded. Annie shook her head. "Sometimes Mrs. Lopez downstairs checks on us. She brings soup if my grandma's coughing a lot. But she has her own kids." "Do you go to school?" "Yes, sir. First grade." There was a hint of pride there. "I'm good at reading." "I believe that," he said. The light turned green. He drove on. A few minutes later, Annie leaned forward slightly. "It's here. The next right." He turned and slowed. The street was narrower than the last, lined with older apartment buildings, whose facades showed every year they'd endured. Half the streetlights worked, the other half flickered weakly, casting long, uneven shadows. "Which building?" he asked. "The third one," Annie said, "with the blue door. It used to be brighter, but the paint peeled." He saw it, a squat building with a cracked stoop and a door that had once been cheerful and now looked tired. Someone had tried to repaint it without sanding first. The effort showed. He pulled over and put the car in park. For a moment, neither of them moved. "Thank you for bringing me," Annie said softly. "I know you didn't have to." He turned in his seat, careful to keep his hands visible, his movements slow. "Are you sure you'll be okay from here?" "Yes," she nodded. "It's just up the stairs. My grandma will be awake." "Do you want me to walk you to the door?" he asked, then paused. "Or would that make things harder?" Annie considered this seriously. "You can come to the door, just not inside. My grandma doesn't like strangers inside when it's late." "That's reasonable," he said. He got out of the car first, stepping into the rain. The night air felt sharper now, more real. He opened the back door and stood aside. Annie climbed out carefully, clutching the medicine. They walked the short distance to the building together. Up close, he could smell damp concrete and old paint. Annie unlocked the door with a small key she wore on a string around her neck. Before she went in, she turned to him. "You didn't tell me your name." He hesitated. Names carried expectations, but some moments deserved honesty. "It's Daniel," he said. "Just Daniel." "I'm Annie," she replied, as if reintroducing herself made the exchange complete. "I won't forget this." "I am," he believed her. As she pushed the door open, a thin line of warm light spilled into the hallway. Somewhere above them, a cough echoed, deep and rattling. Annie's shoulders tensed, then straightened. She looked back one last time. "She's going to sleep better tonight," she said. "Because of you." He watched her disappear inside, the door closing softly behind her. The light vanished. The building returned to its quiet. Daniel stood there for a long moment, rain soaking into his coat, listening to the city breathe around him. He felt no triumph, no relief, just a growing awareness that this night had slipped past the boundaries of a simple good deed. He had driven a child home, and somehow, that felt like the least of what he'd done. If this story moved you even a little, take a moment to show your support. Tap like, share your thoughts in the comments right where you are watching. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, please subscribe to the channel. Your voice keeps these stories alive. Daniel sat behind the wheel longer than he meant to. The engine was still off. The dashboard lights glowed faintly, reflecting against the rain-speckled windshield. Through the glass, the blue door of the building looked duller than it had from the street, its chipped paint catching what little light the hallway offered before the door closed for good. Somewhere upstairs, Annie was climbing those stairs with medicine in her hands, counting steps the way children do when they're tired but determined. Somewhere above that, her grandmother was waiting, listening for a familiar rhythm of footsteps, measuring time by coughs and silence. Daniel rested his forehead briefly against the steering wheel. This was supposed to be the end of it. That had been the agreement he'd made with himself the moment he pulled away from the pharmacy. Get her home. Make sure she's safe. Then return to your life. A clean line. No complications. No entanglements, yet his body hadn't moved to start the car. He straightened, exhaled, and finally turned the key. The engine came to life with a muted hum, too quiet for the thoughts crowding his head. He pulled away from the curb and drove to the end of the block before turning, the building slipping out of view behind him. As he navigated back toward the wider streets, the city felt different, not quieter. New York was never truly quiet, but sharper, as if the edges had been exposed. Every lit window he passed now suggested a story. Every dark one, a question. At a red light, he checked the time again. 3:12 a.m. He should go home. He had meetings in the morning. A schedule built weeks in advance. Assistants who measured his value in minutes. Sleep was already a lost cause. The best he could do was lie down and let his mind pretend to rest. Instead, he found himself dialing a number he hadn't intended to. "Daniel?" came the familiar voice after 2 rings, slightly groggy but alert. "I need a favor," he said. There was a pause on the other end. "It's 3 in the morning. I know. I wouldn't call if it could wait. I was done." Another pause, longer this time. "Is this business or personal?" Daniel watched the rain smear the traffic lights into color. "I'm not sure anymore." "All right," the voice said carefully. "Talk. I need to know what options exist," Daniel said. "Quiet ones, medical, community-based, not charities that put your face on a brochure." The voice sighed. "You're being vague." "I'm trying not to be reckless," Daniel replied. Then, after a beat, "There's a child involved, and an elderly caregiver. No insurance, chronic illness, silence, not confusion, recognition. Send me the address," the voice said finally. "I'll look into what's available in that zip code." "No promises. That's all I'm asking for," Daniel said. He ended the call before he could second-guess himself. The rest of the drive home passed in fragments. Street signs, closed diners, a man sweeping the sidewalk in front of a bodega that wouldn't open for hours, the city's invisible workforce, keeping things upright while everyone else slept. By the time Daniel reached his apartment, dawn was still a distant idea. He stood in the shower longer than usual, letting the water pound against his shoulders, hoping it might wash the night into something manageable. It didn't. Annie's voice followed him, calm and precise, replaying itself against the echo of tile. "I just need to get home." He dressed without turning on the television, made coffee he barely touched. When the sun finally rose, pale and tentative, it felt like an intrusion. At 8:30 a.m., his assistant called. "You're on in 20 minutes, she said. "Do you want the full briefing or just highlights?" "Highlights," Daniel replied automatically. As she spoke, outlining market shifts and regulatory updates, Daniel nodded at the appropriate moments. His body knew the routine. His mind drifted. At 9:17 a.m., another call came through, the same number from earlier. "I did some digging," the voice said. "It's not good." Daniel closed his office door. "Tell me, that building's been flagged before." "Not for anything dramatic, just neglect. Complaints about heating outages, slow maintenance. As for medical assistance..." A pause. "There are programs, long wait lists, paperwork your average person can't navigate without help." "And the grandmother?" Daniel asked. "Hospital visits in the past. ER, mostly. No consistent primary care. It's a cycle." Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the city below. "What about the child?" Another pause. "School records are fine. Attendance is good. Teachers note she's mature for her age." "You know what that usually means." Yes, Daniel knew. "She shouldn't be carrying this alone," he said quietly. "No," the voice agreed. "She shouldn't." They ended the call with an understanding neither of them named. The day wore on. Meetings blurred together. Words like growth and strategy lost their weight. By late afternoon, Daniel found himself standing in front of his office window again, watching clouds gather with the same dull inevitability as the night before. He checked the address once more on his phone. Annie would be home from school by now. She'd probably done her homework at the kitchen table, glancing down the hallway every few minutes to make sure her grandmother was breathing evenly. She'd reheat leftovers if there were any. She'd be careful with the medicine, reading the label even if she didn't understand all the words. No 6-year-old should live like that. Daniel made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like an admission. That evening, just before sunset, he drove back. He parked a block away this time, leaving the car where it wouldn't draw attention. The building looked the same in daylight, no less tired, no less forgotten, but the street felt busier, alive with the low-level noise of people getting through another day. He walked to the blue door and stood there longer than necessary, listening. Voices inside. A television. The rhythm of ordinary life. When he knocked, the sound echoed more loudly than he expected. A moment passed, then another. The door opened a crack. Annie's face appeared, cautious at first. Then her eyes widened. "It's you," she said, surprised but not afraid. "Yes," Daniel replied. "Is your grandmother awake?" Annie nodded. "She's resting." The medicine helped. Daniel felt a quiet relief settle in his chest. "Would it be all right if I spoke with her?" he asked. "Just for a moment. I won't stay long." Annie considered this, weighing it the way she seemed to weigh everything. Finally, she opened the door wider. "Okay," she said. "But she gets tired." "I'll be careful," Daniel promised. As he stepped inside, crossing the threshold of that small apartment, he understood something with absolute clarity. Last night had not ended when he drove away. It had only paused. The apartment was smaller than Daniel had imagined, and that surprised him. He wasn't sure why. He'd seen the building from the outside, understood what kind of neighborhood it sat in, but some part of him had still expected more space, as if hardship needed room to announce itself. It didn't. The living room held a sagging couch with a crocheted blanket draped over one arm, a small coffee table scarred with old rings, and a television that looked older than Annie. A narrow hallway led deeper into the apartment, and from somewhere beyond it came the faint sound of labored breathing, slow and uneven. Annie closed the door quietly behind him. "She's in the bedroom," she whispered. "She just fell asleep again." Daniel nodded, lowering his voice without thinking. "You were right. I won't stay long." Annie padded ahead of him, leading the way down the hallway. He noticed how carefully she walked, avoiding the creaky floorboard near the bathroom, stepping around a loose edge of carpet as if she'd memorized the terrain. This wasn't a child wandering through her home. This was a caretaker navigating a workplace. At the bedroom door, Annie paused and glanced back at him. "She doesn't hear very good anymore," she said. "So, you might have to speak up, but not too much. Loud noises make her cough." "I understand," Daniel said. Annie pushed the door open. The room smelled faintly of menthol and old fabric. The curtains were drawn, but sunlight leaked in around the edges, painting thin stripes across the wall. Ruth lay propped up on pillows, her frame smaller than Daniel expected, her gray hair pulled back into a loose braid that had come undone at the nape of her neck. Her eyes were closed, but they opened slowly when Annie stepped closer. "Baby?" Ruth murmured. "I'm here, Grandma," Annie said immediately, moving to her side. "You're okay. I got the medicine." Ruth's gaze shifted, focusing past Annie for the first time. She frowned slightly, then blinked. "And who's this?" she asked, her voice rough but steady. Daniel stepped forward just enough to be seen clearly. "My name is Daniel," he said. "I helped Annie get home last night." Ruth studied him for a long moment, the way people do when they've learned not to trust first impressions. Her eyes traveled from his face to his coat, his shoes, the careful way he held himself. "You a doctor?" she asked. "No, ma'am." "A policeman?" "No." She nodded once. "Good." Annie smiled faintly, as if this was the expected answer. "She got lost," Daniel said, choosing his words with care. "She asked me for help. I thought it was important she got home safely." Ruth's expression softened, just a little. "That was kind of you," she said. "Not everyone would stop." "No," Daniel agreed. "They wouldn't. Good me." Ruth coughed then. A deep, rattling sound, that seemed to shake her entire body. Annie was instantly at her side, reaching for a glass of water on the nightstand, helping her sit up just enough to sip. Daniel watched, feeling a familiar discomfort settle in his chest. He had seen illness before, of course. He'd funded hospital wings, attended charity galas, where diseases were discussed in abstract terms. This was different. This was personal, immediate. When the coughing subsided, Ruth leaned back against the pillows, breathing slowly. "You didn't have to come back today," she said to Daniel. "Annie told me you already did enough. I wanted to make sure you were all right," he replied. She gave a short, humorless laugh. "That's a rare thing, wanting to make sure." Silence filled the room, not awkward, but heavy with things unsaid. "I won't stay long," Daniel said again. "I just wanted to check in, and to ask if there's anything you need." Ruth's eyes sharpened. "Careful," she said. "That's a dangerous question." Daniel met her gaze. "I know." Annie looked between them, sensing something she didn't fully understand but recognized as important. Ruth sighed. "What we need and what we can accept aren't always the same," she said. "I've lived long enough to know that." Daniel nodded. "I respect that." Another pause. Then Ruth asked, "Why?" The question was simple, but it landed with precision. "Why help us?" she continued. "You don't know us. You don't owe us anything." Daniel hesitated. There were a dozen answers he could give, each one safer than the truth. Responsibility, decency, doing the right thing. All of them felt insufficient. "Because Annie shouldn't have to be that brave," he said finally. "Not at her age." Ruth closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, they were wet. But she didn't let the tears fall. "She's been brave her whole life," Ruth said quietly. "She didn't get a choice." Daniel felt the weight of that settle deep. "I don't want to interfere," he said. "But I do want to help in ways that don't make things harder for you. If you'll allow it." Ruth studied him again, longer this time. "You talk like a man who's used to getting his way." Daniel almost smiled. "Almost. I'm trying not to do that here." Ruth shifted slightly, wincing as she did. "If you're looking to ease your conscience, money won't do it. I've had people offer before. They like the idea of helping more than the act itself." "I'm not here for my conscience," Daniel said. "I'm here because this system is broken, and you're paying for it." Ruth let out a tired breath. "Aren't we all?" Annie had been quiet, her hand resting lightly on her grandmother's arm. Now she spoke up. "He bought medicine too," she said. "For his head." Ruth looked at Daniel, one eyebrow lifting. "That so?" "Yes, ma'am." "Well," Ruth said, managing a faint smile. "Misery does love company." The moment softened something in the room. Daniel felt it, subtle but real. "I should go," he said. "You need rest." Ruth nodded. "Thank you for bringing her home, and for coming back." As Daniel turned to leave, Annie followed him to the hallway. "Will you come again?" she asked, not demanding, just curious. Daniel considered the question. The honest answer scared him a little. "Yes," he said. "If that's all right." Annie smiled then, fully. The kind of smile children only give when something heavy lifts just enough. He stepped back into the hallway, then out into the late afternoon light. The city sounded louder now. Buses groaning, voices rising, life resuming its relentless pace. Daniel stood on the stoop for a moment, breathing it in. This wasn't charity. This was involvement. And he knew, with a certainty that made his stomach tighten, that once you stepped into someone else's reality like this, there was no clean way back out. Daniel didn't go straight home after leaving the building. He walked instead, letting the city absorb him the way it always did when he needed time to think. The sidewalk was busy now, the after-work crowd moving with purpose, headphones in, eyes forward. No one looked twice at him. In this neighborhood, he was just another man in a coat, another figure passing through. But he didn't feel like a passerby anymore. He replayed the scene in the bedroom over and over. The smell of menthol, Ruth's labored breathing, the way Annie hovered with the quiet vigilance of someone twice her age. He'd told himself he wasn't interfering, that he was just checking in. The truth sat heavier than that. He was already involved. By the time he reached his car, the decision had settled into something solid. Not a plan yet. Plans required distance. This was closer to resolve. That night, Daniel made calls he rarely made himself. Not to assistants, not to public-facing charities. He called people who worked behind the scenes, people whose names never appeared on plaques or donor lists. A former hospital administrator who'd left after clashing with a board. A nonprofit director who specialized in navigating Medicaid approvals without making families feel interrogated. A retired social worker who still knew which offices actually answered their phones. He listened more than he spoke. Each conversation sketched the same picture from a different angle. Ruth's situation wasn't unusual. It was common. Painfully so. Elderly caregivers falling through cracks that were wide enough to swallow entire families. Children adapting because no one else would. People think neglect is loud, the retired social worker told him. But most of the time, it's quiet. It looks like responsibility handed down until it breaks someone. Daniel stared out his window as she spoke, the city lights blurring into one another. What would help first? He asked. Consistency, she replied. A doctor who knows her history. Medication she doesn't have to ration. And someone to make sure the kid doesn't become invisible. The kid. Daniel ended the call and sat back, rubbing his temples. This wasn't a problem he could solve with a single transfer or a well-worded email. This was a process. Slow, bureaucratic, resistant to shortcuts. And yet, he knew how systems moved. He'd spent his life learning where pressure changed outcomes. The next afternoon, he returned to the building. This time, he brought groceries. Nothing extravagant. Soup, fresh fruit, bread, tea, things that felt normal, unremarkable. He didn't want to arrive like a solution, just a person. Annie opened the door before he knocked, as if she'd been listening for his footsteps. You came back, she said. Yes, Daniel replied. Is this a good time? She nodded and stepped aside. Grandma's awake. She's watching her show. The living room looked the same as before, but now Daniel noticed details he'd missed. A stack of mail on the table, unopened. Prescription bottles lined neatly by the television. Labels worn from handling. A school backpack by the couch, frayed at the seams. Ruth sat upright now, wrapped in a sweater that looked too thin for the season. The television murmured softly. A daytime talk show playing to an audience of none. Well, Ruth said when she saw him. You're persistent. Daniel smiled faintly. I brought some things, only if it's all right. She eyed the bags. We don't need charity. I know, he said. That's why I brought groceries, not money. That earned him a thoughtful look. Annie helped unpack without being asked, moving efficiently, putting things away where they belonged. Daniel watched her, struck again by how practiced she was. No wasted motion, no excitement, just quiet competence. Ruth cleared her throat. You make a habit of this? She asked Daniel. Dropping in on strangers' lives? No, he said honestly. This is new, she snorted. Lucky us. Daniel took a breath. I've been making some calls, trying to understand what options exist that won't disrupt your life more than it already has been. Ruth stiffened slightly. I didn't ask for that. His Dangtu did the work. I know, Daniel said. And nothing will happen without your consent. I wanted to talk first. Annie paused, glancing between them. Ruth studied him, searching for the angle. What do you want in return? Daniel didn't hesitate. Nothing. That's not an answer, she said. It's the only honest one I have. He replied. I don't want credit. I don't want gratitude. I want Annie to be a kid. And I want you to get care without having to fight for every inch of it. Away. Silence settled over the room. Ruth leaned back, exhaustion etched deep into her face. You think you can fix what broke long before you showed up? No, Daniel said quietly. But I think I can take some weight off, if you let me. Annie edged closer to her grandmother, her hand slipping into Ruth's. Ruth closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them again, something had shifted. Not trust. Not yet. But willingness. All right, she said. We can talk. Just talk. No decisions. Islata goaded. That's fair, Daniel replied. Over the next hour, they talked. Ruth spoke about her health in blunt terms. The pain that flared without warning. The fear of hospitals. Born from past bills she still didn't understand. Annie listened closely, correcting small details, reminding her grandmother of things she'd forgotten. Daniel took mental notes, careful not to interrupt. He learned that Annie woke up early to make breakfast, that she packed her own lunch most days, that she checked the medicine schedule better than any alarm. When it was time to leave, Daniel stood by the door, hesitating. I'll come back, he said, with information, options. Nothing will be decided without you. Ruth nodded. We'll see. Annie walked him to the door. Thank you for the soup, she said. Grandma likes soup. I'm glad, Daniel replied. As he stepped out into the hallway, Annie looked up at him. You're not scared, are you? He considered the question. I am, he admitted, but not of the right things. She seemed to think that over, then nodded. That's okay. Grandma says being scared doesn't mean you stop. Daniel smiled. Walking back to his car, he understood something clearly now. Helping them would cost him time, energy, attention, maybe more, but doing nothing would cost something too. And this time, he was choosing what kind of cost he was willing to pay. Daniel learned quickly that good intentions moved slower than money. The following days settled into a rhythm he hadn't planned for and couldn't quite escape. Mornings were still filled with meetings, calls layered over calls, the familiar language of growth projections and risk exposure. But now, threaded through all of it, were other conversations quieter, more precise, and far less forgiving. He spent hours on the phone with clinics that promised sliding scale care but booked months out. He listened to administrators recite policy as if it were scripture, each clause another locked door. He watched his own patients tested in ways no negotiation ever had, because there was no leverage here that felt clean to use. At night, when the city dimmed and the calls stopped, Annie's face returned to him. Not pleading, not grateful, just expectant in that steady way children have when they believe adults mean what they say. By Thursday, he had something tangible, not a miracle, not a solution, but a start. He drove back to the building in the early evening, the sky streaked orange and gray, the air heavy with the promise of rain. He parked farther down the block again, out of habit now, and walked the rest of the way. Annie opened the door before he knocked. You came back, she said, as if confirming a theory. Yes, Daniel replied. Is your grandmother up? She's in the kitchen, Annie said. She's making tea, even though she shouldn't be standing so long. With CY, Daniel followed her inside. The apartment smelled warmer tonight, ginger, lemon, something faintly sweet. Ruth stood at the counter, leaning slightly, one hand braced against the edge. I told her to sit, Annie whispered. She doesn't listen. Ruth turned when she heard them. I listen fine, she said. I just don't obey. Daniel smiled. That tracks. She lowered herself into a chair with a controlled exhale. What brings you back this time? I have information, Daniel said, and questions. Still no decisions. Ruth nodded once. All right. They sat at the small kitchen table, the tea between them steaming gently. Annie took her usual place beside her grandmother, legs swinging slightly, alert but quiet. There's a clinic 3 neighborhoods over, Daniel began. They can take you on as a patient within 2 weeks. It's not perfect, but it's consistent. Same doctor, regular follow-ups. Ruth raised an eyebrow. 2 weeks is fast. It is, Daniel agreed. They had a cancellation, and someone who knows how to navigate their intake process. Ruth studied him over the rim of her mug. Someone you called? Yes. And what does that cost? She asked. On paper? Daniel said. Very little. In practice, time and paperwork. I can help with that part if you want. Silence followed, dense and careful. And the medicine? Ruth asked. There's a pharmacy program tied to the clinic, Daniel said. They'll cover most of it. The rest, we'll figure out. Ruth's jaw tightened. I don't want to owe you. Daniel met her gaze steadily. You don't. That's not how it works, she said. Nothing comes free. I'm not asking for anything in return, he said again. Not now. Not later. Ruth looked down at her hands. They were worn, joints swollen, nails trimmed short and clean, hands that had worked for decades, quietly, without complaint. People don't do this, she said finally. Not without a reason. Daniel chose his words carefully. Sometimes the reason is simply that no one else did. Annie shifted in her chair. Does this mean Grandma won't have to go to the emergency room anymore? She asked. Ruth shot her a look. Annie, it's okay, Daniel said gently. That's the hope. Annie nodded slowly, absorbing that. That would be good, she said. She hates the waiting. Ruth closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. All right, she said. We'll try your clinic. Just the clinic. Nothing else yet. That's fair, Daniel replied. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folder, not thick, not official looking, just organized. This is the information, he said, sliding it across the table. Appointments, directions, a name to ask for. Ruth didn't touch it right away. And Annie? She asked quietly. Daniel paused. What about her? She's 6, Ruth said. I won't always be here to manage this, and I won't have strangers circling her life. 8. I don't want to manage her life, Daniel said. And I don't want to circle it, but I do want to make sure she has support that doesn't disappear when things get hard. Ruth studied him. Meaning? School programs, aftercare if you want it. Someone to help with logistics so Annie doesn't have to. Annie looked up. I don't mind helping, she said quickly. Daniel smiled at her, then softened his voice. I know you don't, but you shouldn't have to do it all. With Rose. Ruth reached out and placed her hand over Annie's. She's right, she said. You're a child. You deserve to be one. Annie frowned slightly, as if the concept were unfamiliar. Ruth turned back to Daniel. We'll take this one step at a time, she said. No rushing. No surprises. Agreed, Daniel said. They talked a little longer, about practical things. Schedules, transportation, what Annie liked at school, and what she struggled with. Daniel listened more than he spoke, noting how often Ruth deferred to Annie's input, how naturally the child advocated for herself and her grandmother. When it was time to leave, Daniel stood by the door again, the ritual already familiar. Thank you, Ruth said. Not warmly. Not yet, but sincerely. You're welcome, Daniel replied. Annie walked him to the hallway. You did a lot today, she said. So did you, Daniel replied. She considered that. Grandma says people show who they are by what they keep doing, not what they say once. She's wise, Daniel said. Annie nodded. She is. As Daniel stepped back into the stairwell, he felt something settle into place. This wasn't about rescue, or saviors, or fixing broken things from the outside. This was about staying. And staying, he was beginning to understand, required a different kind of courage than walking away ever had. The first appointment was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Daniel knew the date without checking his calendar. He'd repeated it to himself enough times that it had settled into his body like a deadline that mattered more than any board meeting. Tuesday, 9:30 a.m., intake, new patient, bring documents, arrive early. He arrived earlier than that. The clinic sat on a corner between a laundromat and a discount grocery store, its brick exterior softened by a mural that tried hard to feel hopeful. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee. Plastic chairs lined the walls, most of them already occupied. Daniel spotted Annie and Ruth immediately. They sat together near the far end of the room. Ruth wore her thin gray coat, buttoned all the way up, her posture straight but rigid. Annie sat beside her, feet dangling, swinging slightly in that slow, repetitive way children used to steady themselves in unfamiliar places. Daniel approached quietly, not wanting to startle them. You're early, Ruth said, noticing him before he spoke. So are you, Daniel replied. Ruth sniffed. If you're late to places like this, they punish you by making you wait longer. Annie looked up and smiled. Not the full smile from before. Something smaller, more cautious. Good morning, Daniel said. Good morning, Annie echoed. They sat together then, 3 people from different worlds bound by the same uncomfortable bench. Around them, conversations murmured in half voices, Coughs. Paperwork shuffled. Someone arguing quietly at the front desk about a form they didn't understand. Daniel watched Annie as she took it all in. Her eyes moved constantly, noting exits, listening for her grandmother's breathing, absorbing the room like information she might need later. This wasn't new to her. A nurse called Ruth's name. Ruth stood slowly, leaning on her cane. Annie rose immediately, reaching for her hand. "She can come with me," Ruth said before the nurse could object. The nurse hesitated, then nodded. Of course. Daniel remained seated, deliberately so. This was their space. He had promised not to take over. He waited. Minutes stretched. Then more minutes. The waiting room thinned and refilled, time looping strangely the way it always did in places built on uncertainty. When Ruth and Annie returned, Ruth looked tired but alert. Annie's face was unreadable. "They want blood work," Ruth said, lowering herself into the chair. "And imaging, which means more appointments." Daniel nodded. "That's expected." Ruth eyed him. "You sound like someone who's done this before." "Ike, I've seen it," Daniel replied. "From the other side." "That figures," Ruth muttered. They scheduled follow-ups. Daniel wrote down dates, making sure Annie could see where everything went. He didn't want this to feel like something happening around her without her understanding. As they left the clinic, the morning had warmed slightly. The street was louder now, alive with the movement of people who had places to be. Annie tugged gently at Daniel's sleeve. "They were nice," she said. The doctor talked slow. "That's good," Daniel replied. Ruth nodded. He listened. "That's rarer than people think." They walked together toward the corner. Daniel paused. "I can drive you home," he offered. "If you'd like." Ruth considered this, then nodded. "All right." My legs could use the break. The ride back was quieter than before. Not tense, just thoughtful. Halfway there, Annie spoke up. "Are you coming again next time?" Daniel answered honestly. "If you want me to." "I teens CEO." Ruth glanced at Annie. Annie glanced back. "Yes," Annie said. Ruth sighed. "Looks like you've been voted in." Daniel smiled faintly. That afternoon, Daniel sat through a meeting he barely heard. Numbers moved across screens. Voices rose and fell. Someone joked about market volatility. Daniel nodded at the right times, but his mind was elsewhere. That evening, a different call came in. Not from a clinic. Not from a social worker. From his legal counsel. "I'm hearing things," the lawyer said. "You've been making inquiries, medical access, community services, that sort of thing." "Yes," Daniel replied. "There's concern," the lawyer continued carefully. "About optics, about exposure. You know how these things can spiral." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "I'm not doing anything illegal." "I didn't say you were," the lawyer replied. "I'm saying people notice when you step outside your usual lanes." Daniel stared out the window. "Let them notice." A pause. "This could complicate things." "Yes," Daniel said. "It could." He ended the call without further explanation. Later that night, he found himself walking again. Same neighborhood, same blue door. This time, he didn't knock. He stood across the street, watching the building as lights flickered on and off behind different windows. Somewhere inside, Annie was probably doing homework. Ruth might be resting, or watching television, or coughing quietly into a pillow she didn't want to wake the child with. Daniel understood something then that made his chest ache. Systems didn't break people all at once. They did it slowly, invisibly, by teaching children to be adults too soon, by teaching elders to expect less and less until expecting nothing felt like dignity. His phone buzzed. A text from a board member. Casual, curious. "Everything okay? You seem distracted lately." "I wouldn't zering absided." Daniel typed a response, then deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. Finally, he wrote, "Just seeing things more clearly." He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Across the street, the blue door opened briefly. Annie stepped out, holding a small bag of trash. She paused, looking up at the sky, then glanced around. For a moment, Daniel thought she might see him. She didn't. She went back inside, the door closing softly behind her. Daniel turned and walked away. He knew now that what he was doing would not remain quiet forever. Attention followed action, especially when it disrupted comfortable narratives. But comfort, he was learning, was a luxury built on someone else's endurance. And Annie had endured enough. The first sign of trouble arrived quietly. It came in the form of a letter slipped under Daniel's office door late one afternoon. Folded once, no envelope, no letterhead. He noticed it only because it disrupted the perfect symmetry his assistant kept without effort. The paper was plain. The message, typed, was shorter than he expected. You're drawing attention. Not all of it is friendly. Be careful whose problems you make your own. No signature. Daniel read it twice, then a third time. He felt no fear at first, only irritation. Anonymous warnings were a common currency in his world, usually sent by people who mistook proximity for power. Still, he didn't throw it away. That evening, he drove to the building again, parking farther than usual, his instincts tightening without fully announcing themselves. The street looked ordinary. Too ordinary. Kids played near the corner, their laughter sharp against the hum of traffic. A woman argued into her phone. A delivery truck idled, engine rattling. Nothing out of place. Inside the apartment, Annie was sprawled on the living room floor with her homework, pencil clenched between her teeth in concentration. Ruth sat on the couch, bundled in a blanket, watching her with an expression that was equal parts pride and worry. "You're late," Ruth said when Daniel entered. "I know," Daniel replied. "Meetings ran long, that's what they always say," Ruth muttered. Annie looked up. "I'm learning fractions," she announced. "They're annoying." Daniel smiled. "They can be. Want help?" She nodded eagerly, scooting closer. As they worked through the problems together, Daniel felt the tension in his chest ease slightly. There was something grounding about sitting on the floor, explaining halves and quarters to a child who asked earnest questions and accepted answers without cynicism. For a little while, the world narrowed to pencil marks and quiet voices. It didn't last. A knock sounded at the door. Not loud, not aggressive, just firm enough to demand attention. Ruth stiffened immediately. Annie froze, pencil hovering midair. "I'll get it," Daniel said calmly. Ruth grabbed his sleeve. "No." He met her gaze. "Let me see who it is." Another knock, louder this time. Daniel walked to the door and opened it a crack. A man stood in the hallway, early 40s, neatly dressed, holding a clipboard that looked more symbolic than useful. "Mr. Rand." "Hale?" the man asked. Daniel's jaw tightened. He hadn't introduced himself here with his full name. "Yes," Daniel replied evenly. "I'm with the city," the man said. "Housing and wellness check. We received a report." Ruth had risen from the couch, cane in hand. "A report of what?" The man glanced past Daniel, taking in the apartment with a practiced sweep. "Concern about a minor providing primary care to an elderly resident." The words landed like a slap. Annie stood slowly, moving toward her grandmother. "That's not true," Ruth said sharply. "I take care of my granddaughter. We just need to ask a few questions," the man said, tone smooth. "It won't take long." Daniel stepped fully into the doorway now, positioning himself between the man and the apartment. "On what basis was this report made?" The man shifted slightly. "We don't disclose sources." "I'm aware of the policy," Daniel replied. "I'm also aware of residents' rights. Do you have a warrant?" The man's smile thinned. "We're not here to cause trouble. Then you won't mind coming back at a scheduled time," Daniel said. "With proper notice." Ruth's breathing had grown shallow. Annie clutched her hand. The man hesitated, calculated. "We'll follow up," he said finally. "This won't go away." Daniel nodded. "I'm sure it won't." "Daniel." The man turned and walked down the hall. Daniel closed the door gently and leaned against it for a moment, listening to his own pulse. Ruth spoke first. Someone called them. Annie looked up, eyes wide. "Are they going to take me away?" "No," Daniel said immediately, kneeling to her level. "No one is taking you anywhere." Ruth's voice trembled despite her effort to control it. "This is what I was afraid of. This is what happens when attention finds you." Daniel took a breath. "I should have anticipated this. Stewart, that Destany Stewart. You think?" Ruth snapped, then softened. I don't blame you, but I don't trust systems that pretend to help. By threatening, Annie pressed her face into her grandmother's side. I don't want to go. Daniel felt something harden inside him. They won't, he said again. Not without cause. And there is none. Ruth studied him. You sure about that? Daniel didn't answer right away. That night, after he left, Daniel made calls with a different tone than before. Lawyers, advocates, people who understood how quickly concern could be weaponized against the vulnerable. By morning, he had confirmation of what he already suspected. The report hadn't come from a neighbor. It had come from someone watching him, someone who believed pressure would make him retreat. Daniel stood in his office, the city unfolding beneath him, and felt the familiar calculus return. Risk, exposure, cost. But this time, there was something else in the equation. Annie's face when she'd asked if they were going to take her away. He picked up the phone and made one more call. This stops now, he said when the line connected. Quietly or publicly. A pause. Then, you're making this bigger than it needs to be. Daniel's voice was calm. No. You did. He ended the call and stared out at the city, knowing the line had been crossed. This was no longer just about help. It was about protection. Daniel did not sleep that night. He lay on top of the covers in his apartment, fully dressed, the city's distant sirens threading through the silence like a warning he could no longer ignore. Every time he closed his eyes, the same image returned. Annie's face pressed into her grandmother's side, small shoulders tight with fear, asking a question no child should ever have to ask. Are they going to take me away? By morning, the fear had hardened into something else. Resolve. Daniel arrived at his office before sunrise. The building was quiet, the kind of quiet reserved for janitors and men who preferred to move before the world noticed. He made coffee himself, black, untouched on his desk as he began making calls. Not favors this time. Instructions. By 9 o'clock, his legal team was assembled in the conference room. 2 attorneys, one specializing in family law, the other in administrative oversight. Both listened carefully as Daniel laid out the situation. Every detail precise, unemotional. This was not a random welfare check, he concluded. It was triggered intentionally. The family lawyer nodded slowly. Then we treat it as harassment disguised as concern. And escalation? Daniel asked. Likely, the administrative attorney said. Once a report is made, they rarely stop at one visit, especially if they believe the environment includes influence. Daniel almost smiled. Almost. Good, he said. Then we get ahead of it. By midday, formal notices were drafted. Requests for documentation, demands for transparency, a clear paper trail establishing that Annie was not neglected, that Ruth was receiving medical care, that no child endangerment existed. Daniel knew the language well. He'd used it to protect companies. Now, he was using it to protect 2 people the system barely saw. That afternoon, he went back to the building. Ruth opened the door this time, her expression guarded but relieved when she saw him. They didn't come back, she said. They won't without warning, Daniel replied. Not now. Annie hovered behind her, peeking around the doorway. You're not mad, are you? Annie asked quietly. Daniel crouched down in front of her. At you? Never. At Grandma? No. Annie hesitated. At me? Daniel met her eyes. The only people I'm mad at are the ones who think scaring a child is acceptable. Is occluded. She seemed to consider that, then nodded once. Inside, the apartment felt different. Tighter. As if the walls themselves had heard the knock and hadn't relaxed since. Ruth sat down heavily. I've lived my whole life trying not to be noticed, she said. Seems like that doesn't work anymore. It never really did, Daniel replied gently. It just delayed things. She eyed him. You could still walk away. Yes, Daniel said. I could. But you won't. No, Ruth hid. Then we need rules. Daniel nodded. I agree. They talked for a long time. Boundaries were drawn carefully. Daniel would not make decisions without Ruth's consent. Annie would not be questioned without an advocate present. Any further contact from city agencies would go through Daniel's legal team first. This doesn't make you our boss, Ruth said firmly. I wouldn't want to be, Daniel replied. It makes you what then? Daniel thought for a moment. A shield. For now. And Ruth studied him, then gave a small nod. All right. For now. Annie listened closely, absorbing every word. Later, as Daniel prepared to leave, Annie followed him into the hallway. They're scared of you, she said matter-of-factly. Who is? Daniel asked. The people who came. Annie replied. They don't like it when someone stands in front. Daniel smiled faintly. You noticed that? She shrugged. You stood like this. She squared her tiny shoulders, imitating his stance at the door. Grandma stands like that when she means no. Something in Daniel's chest tightened. That was very observant, he said. She looked up at him. Are you going to get in trouble? Daniel considered the question carefully. Maybe. That's bad, Annie said. Sometimes, he replied. Sometimes, it's necessary. She thought about that. Grandma says trouble finds you faster when you're doing the right thing. Daniel nodded. She's right. That evening, as Daniel walked back to his car, his phone rang. An unfamiliar number. He answered. You're overstepping, a man's voice said calmly. Older, confident. This isn't your role. Daniel stopped walking. You made it my role when you used a child as leverage. A pause. You don't understand the attention you're inviting. Daniel smiled. Cold this time. I understand it perfectly. And I'm not blinking. Another pause. Longer now. This ends when you back off. That is heated. No, Daniel said. This ends when you do. He ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket. For the first time since this began, he felt something close to certainty. The warning letter. The welfare check. The anonymous pressure. It was all meant to test him. To see if he would retreat into comfort and distance. He hadn't. And now, whoever had started this knew something they hadn't counted on. Daniel Hale did not abandon what he chose to protect. The pressure did not come all at once. It arrived in pieces, subtle enough that most people would have dismissed them as coincidence. A delayed permit. A zoning inquiry that had nothing to do with any property Daniel owned. A request from a regulatory office asking for clarification on a matter that had been settled years ago. None of it was overt. All of it was deliberate. Daniel recognized the pattern immediately. This was how power reminded you it existed, never loudly, never directly, but persistently, like a hand tightening around your wrist while smiling at your face. He did not react. Outwardly, his life continued as usual. Meetings, calls, public appearances, where his name was spoken with respect and careful distance. He wore the same tailored suits, spoke in the same measured tone, played the role he'd mastered over decades. Privately, everything shifted. He increased security around Ruth and Annie's building without making it visible. No guards in uniform. No cameras suddenly sprouting from walls, just quiet adjustments, lighting repaired faster than usual. Patrol routes altered. A retired cop now working night shifts nearby without anyone asking why. Ruth noticed anyway. You think I don't see what you're doing? She said one evening as Daniel sat at the small kitchen table, helping Annie with spelling words. Daniel glanced up. I hoped you wouldn't have to, Ruth snorted. I've survived long enough by noticing what other people hope I won't. Annie looked between them. Is something wrong? No, Ruth said immediately. Something's being handled. Daniel met Ruth's eyes. If at any point this feels like too much, I'll tell you, Ruth cut in. Don't mistake caution for fear. Daniel nodded. He respected that. The next escalation came through Annie's school. It started with a call from the principal requesting a meeting. Polite. Routine. Daniel attended with Ruth, sitting slightly back, making sure his presence didn't dominate the room. We've noticed some changes, the principal said, folding her hands on the desk. Annie is bright, attentive, but she seems alert, almost hyper-aware. Ruth stiffened. She's always been observant. Of course, the principal said quickly. We're not concerned. We just want to ensure she has the support she needs. Daniel leaned forward slightly. What kind of support? Counseling, the principal replied. Optional, preventative. Daniel recognized the language. Preventative often meant preemptive documentation. "We'll consider it," Ruth said coolly. Outside the school, Annie tugged at Ruth's sleeve. "Am I in trouble?" "No, baby," Ruth said, bending slightly to meet her eyes. "You're just growing up in a world that likes to ask questions when it doesn't understand people," Daniel added gently. "And sometimes when it does." Annie frowned. "That doesn't make sense." "It will," Ruth said quietly. Later, that night, Daniel met with his legal team again. "They're widening the net," the family lawyer said. "Testing for stress points. School, housing, healthcare, all under the guise of concern." "And the source?" Daniel asked. The lawyer hesitated. "Still indirect, but the pressure is consistent with someone who wants you distracted or discouraged." Daniel's jaw tightened. "That won't work." "No," the lawyer agreed. "But it means we need to decide something." "What?" "How visible you're willing to be." Daniel leaned back in his chair. Visibility had always been a double-edged sword. He'd learned long ago when to step forward and when to disappear, but this wasn't about him anymore. "I won't hide," he said, "and I won't expose them." "Then we create structure," the lawyer said. "Formalize your role. Make your involvement legitimate and boring." Daniel almost smiled. Boring is good. Within a week, the structure was in place. Daniel became Ruth's officially designated advocate for medical and administrative matters. Everything documented. Transparent. Legal. Annie's school received formal notice that any inquiries beyond routine would require Ruth's consent and legal review. The noise didn't stop, but it changed tone. Less intimidation, more caution. Ruth noticed that too. "They're backing off," she said one evening, sipping tea with shaking hands that annoyed her more than the illness. "Not retreating, just reassessing." Daniel nodded. "They're realizing this won't be easy." Ruth looked at him sharply. "You could have chosen easy." "Yes," Daniel said. "I could have." Annie, curled up on the couch with a library book, looked up. "Why didn't you?" Daniel thought for a long moment before answering. "Because easy usually means someone else carries the weight," he said. "And you've carried enough." Annie didn't respond right away. Then she said, "Grandma says when people choose you, it's more important than when they help you." Ruth blinked, surprised. "I say that? You said it last night," Annie replied. "When you thought I was asleep." Daniel felt something quiet and heavy settle in his chest. Later that night, after Annie was asleep and Ruth had retreated to her bedroom, Daniel stood by the window, looking out at the street below, the same street where a little girl had once stood under a pharmacy awning and asked for a ride home. He understood now that the moment hadn't been accidental, not because of fate or destiny, but because systems always eventually test the edges. And sometimes, those edges are people. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You've made your point. This doesn't need to continue." Daniel stared at the screen. He typed back only 4 words. "It ends with her safe." No response came. Daniel turned off the phone and let the city hum around him. He knew the conflict wasn't over. Not truly. But something had shifted. The line had been drawn. And for the first time since this began, Daniel felt that the ground beneath them, beneath Annie and Ruth, was a little more solid. Not because the world had become fair, but because someone had decided not to step aside. The calm that followed was not peace. It was the kind of quiet that comes after a door closes too carefully, when everyone involved pretends the conversation is over, while still listening from the other side. Daniel recognized it immediately. He had lived most of his adult life inside that kind of silence, but Annie did not. She noticed the change in ways that were small and unsettling. Fewer unfamiliar faces lingering near the building. No more surprise calls from the school. Even the hallway felt different, less tense, as if the walls themselves had stopped bracing for impact. "Did we win?" Annie asked one evening as Daniel walked her and Ruth back from the clinic. Daniel paused. "No," he said honestly. "But we're not losing right now." Annie accepted this, though she didn't fully understand it. Children were good at that, holding space for answers that didn't resolve cleanly. Ruth, on the other hand, understood exactly what it meant. "They're waiting," she said later, once Annie had gone to brush her teeth. "People like that don't let go. They just change tactics." "Yes," Daniel agreed. That's why we don't relax. We normalize. Ruth gave him a sideways look. You make this sound like a business strategy. In a way, it is, Daniel replied. Consistency is disarming. The clinic visits became routine. Blood work, imaging, adjustments to medication. Ruth complained about the waiting rooms, the fluorescent lights, the way doctors spoke in cautious half-sentences. But her breathing improved. The coughing spells shortened. Annie stopped waking up at night to listen for signs of distress. Small changes, quiet victories. One afternoon, Daniel arrived to find Annie sitting at the kitchen table with a woman he didn't recognize. The woman wore practical shoes, a canvas bag slung over one shoulder. Her posture relaxed but alert. This is Miss Carter, Annie announced proudly. She helps with after-school stuff. Daniel looked to Ruth. I approved it, Ruth said before he could ask. School program. 2 days a week. Annie stays there until I'm home from my appointment or until you come by. Daniel nodded. That's good. Miss Carter smiled politely. Annie's very capable. Ruth snorted. Too capable. That evening, after Miss Carter left and Annie disappeared into her room with a book, Ruth spoke quietly. I don't want her thinking she's being handed off, she said. I want her to know she's supported, not managed. I agree, Daniel said. Support should feel like scaffolding, not a cage. Ruth studied him. You didn't grow up poor. No, Daniel replied. But I grew up invisible. Different problem. Same damage. That earned him a thoughtful look. Weeks passed. The pressure stayed distant but present, like bad weather on the horizon. Daniel continued his work, splitting his time between worlds with increasing precision. He did not speak publicly about Annie or Ruth. He did not retreat either. Visibility, when controlled, became armor. The next test came unexpectedly. Daniel was in his office when his assistant knocked, her expression unreadable. There's a woman here to see you, she said. She says it's personal. Daniel frowned. Did she give a name? She said you'd know why she's here. Daniel exhaled slowly. Send her in. The woman who entered was in her late 50s. Well-dressed but not ostentatious. Her hair was silver, her expression sharp but not hostile. She closed the door behind her carefully. You've caused quite a ripple, she said without preamble. Daniel gestured to the chair across from him. Sit. She did. You're protecting a child who was never meant to be yours to protect. Daniel leaned back. Children don't belong to systems. They belong to people who show up. Right. She smiled thinly. Idealism doesn't change outcomes. No, Daniel said. But action does. She studied him. You're aware this complicates future negotiations, alliances, access. I'm aware, Daniel replied. And you're willing to accept that cost? Daniel didn't hesitate. Yes, the woman sighed. You're making yourself an inconvenience. Daniel smiled faintly. I've been called worse. She stood. Very well. Just understand this ends one of two ways. Either you grow tired, or the attention shifts. And if it shifts, Daniel asked, then someone else becomes the lesson. Daniel's smile vanished. Not her. The woman met his gaze, something unreadable flickering there. Then she nodded once and left without another word. That night, Daniel didn't go home. He went to the blue-doored building and sat at the small kitchen table with Ruth, while Annie worked on a puzzle on the floor. They came to see you, Ruth said, not asking. Yes. 80. And? They're adjusting expectations. Ruth snorted softly. That usually means sharpening knives. Daniel looked at Annie. We may need to change some routines. Nothing drastic. Just awareness. Annie glanced up. Like looking both ways, even when the light's green? Yes, Daniel said. Exactly like that. She nodded and went back to her puzzle. Later, after Annie was asleep, Ruth spoke again. You know, she said quietly, when I took Annie in, I thought the hardest part would be money, or health, or fear. Daniel waited. I was wrong. Ruth continued. The hardest part is knowing the world will test her kindness. Try to turn it into weakness. Daniel felt the weight of that settle deep. I won't let that happen, he said. Ruth looked at him, tired but steady. You can't promise that. No, Daniel admitted. But I can promise she won't face it alone. Ruth nodded. That's all anyone can ask. As Daniel left that night, he paused at the door, listening to the quiet apartment behind him. A child sleeping. An old woman breathing easier than she had months ago. Outside, the city continued its restless churn. Daniel understood now that the real conflict wasn't with the people applying pressure. It was with the idea that some lives were negotiable. He had chosen his side, and he would hold it. Winter arrived without ceremony. One morning, Annie woke to frost, tracing delicate patterns across the apartment window, thin white veins branching like a map she couldn't read yet. She pressed her palm to the glass and pulled back quickly, startled by the cold. "Grandma," she called. "It's freezing outside." Ruth smiled faintly from her chair. That's how winter announces itself. No warning, just presence. Dimeside. Daniel arrived later that afternoon carrying a new coat for Annie. Navy blue, practical, warm without being showy. He handed it to her quietly, without comment. Annie slipped it on, testing the sleeves. "It's heavy," she said. "That's the point," Daniel replied. "Some things are meant to hold weight." Ruth watched the exchange with a careful eye. She didn't object. She no longer objected to everything. That alone told Daniel how much had changed. The season brought challenges that no amount of planning could fully soften. Ruth's joints stiffened in the cold. Her breathing worsened on damp days. Appointments multiplied. Some necessary, some redundant, all exhausting. Annie adjusted without complaint. She learned to layer her clothes. She packed snacks for long clinic waits. She stopped asking when things would be normal again, as if she'd quietly accepted that normal was a word adults used when they didn't have better ones. Daniel noticed. One evening, as snow began to fall in earnest, Annie sat beside him on the couch, watching flakes drift past the window. "Do you ever get tired?" she asked suddenly. Daniel glanced at her. "Yes. Like, tired, she pressed. He considered the question. "Yes, that kind too." Annie nodded. "Me too." The honesty of it struck him. "You shouldn't have to feel that way," he said gently. Annie shrugged. "Grandma says being tired doesn't mean you stop. It just means you rest when you can." Daniel smiled. "She's right." That night, the power went out. It happened just after midnight. The apartment plunging into sudden darkness, the hum of the refrigerator cutting off mid-breath. Annie sat up in bed, heart racing. "Grandma?" she called. "I'm here," Ruth replied from the living room. Just the lights. Daniel, who had stayed late to review paperwork with Ruth, stood immediately. "It's a grid issue," he said calmly. "Probably weather-related." Ruth coughed, the sound sharper in the cold air. Annie hurried out of her room, wrapped in her blanket. "It's okay," Daniel said, lighting a small lantern he'd brought for emergencies. The soft glow filled the room, chasing away the worst of the dark. They sat together, the three of them, bundled and quiet, listening to the wind rattle the windows. "This reminds me of when I was little," Ruth said after a while. "Power went out all the time back then. We used candles, told stories." "What kind of stories?" Annie asked. "The kind where people did the right thing even when it cost them," Ruth replied. "Those were my favorite." Daniel felt the weight of that sentence settle between them. Hours later, when the power finally returned, none of them rushed to turn on the lights. The lantern stayed lit a little longer, as if they were reluctant to let the moment dissolve. The next escalation came 2 weeks later. This time, it wasn't subtle. Daniel received a formal notice requesting his presence at a municipal review panel. The language was careful, the tone neutral, but the implication was clear. His involvement had crossed from tolerated to scrutinized. He read the notice once, then folded it neatly. Ruth watched him from the kitchen. "They're not done," she said. "No," Daniel agreed. "They're escalating." "And what does that mean for us?" she asked. Daniel met her gaze. "It means they'll try to frame this as dependency, as impropriety, as something that needs correcting." Ruth's jaw tightened. "And Annie? They won't touch her directly," Daniel said. "Not yet. But they'll circle." Ruth stood slowly. "I won't let them make her feel like a problem." "Neither will I," Daniel said. The panel meeting took place in a windowless room that smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant. Daniel sat alone at the long table, hands folded, posture relaxed. The questions came steadily. Why had he involved himself? What authority did he claim? Was there a financial arrangement? Was the child influenced by his presence? Daniel answered each one plainly. He cited documentation. He referenced consent. He spoke of advocacy, not control. Support, not ownership. When the meeting ended, the chairwoman studied him carefully. "You understand," she said, "that the concern here is precedent." Daniel nodded. "I do. And you're comfortable setting one?" "Yes," he replied. Outside, the cold air felt sharper than before. That evening, Daniel went directly to the apartment. Ruth was waiting. Annie sat at the table, drawing carefully with colored pencils. "They asked me questions today," Annie said without looking up. Daniel paused. "Who did?" "Someone from school," Annie replied. "They asked if I felt safe, if I liked when you came over." Ruth's eyes flashed. "I told them, it's okay," Daniel said gently. He knelt beside Annie. "What did you tell them?" Annie looked up, meeting his eyes with calm certainty. "I said, I feel safe because people show up, and because Grandma's not alone." Daniel swallowed. "That was very brave," he said. Annie shrugged. "I wasn't scared." Ruth reached out, pulling Annie close. "You shouldn't have had to answer that, but I did," Annie said softly. "And it's true." Later that night, after Annie was asleep, Ruth spoke in a low voice. "They're going to keep testing," she said, "until someone blinks." Daniel nodded. "I know. You could still step back," Ruth said. "Let them think they won." Daniel looked at the hallway leading to Annie's room. That would teach her the wrong lesson. Ruth studied him for a long moment. "Which is, that people disappear when things get uncomfortable," Daniel said. "And I won't be that person." Ruth exhaled slowly. "Then neither will I." Isnotic. Outside, snow continued to fall, quiet and relentless, covering the city in a thin white layer that hid cracks but didn't repair them. Daniel understood that the coming months would be harder. More scrutiny, more pressure, more moments where the easy path whispered its appeal. But he also understood something else now. Annie was watching, and sometimes the most important thing you could give a child wasn't protection from the world but proof that standing firm was possible. By February, the snow had turned gray. It clung to the edges of sidewalks and the corners of buildings. No longer clean or gentle, but stubborn, compacted by weeks of footsteps and neglect. Annie learned to step around the worst patches, guiding Ruth with a confidence that no longer surprised anyone. Daniel noticed the way people looked at them now, not openly, not rudely, just long enough to recognize that something about this small family didn't fit the expected shape. A white man in an expensive coat walking beside a black child and her elderly grandmother through a neighborhood most people passed without seeing. Curiosity mixed with suspicion. Familiar, tired reactions. He ignored them. What mattered was inside the apartment. Ruth's health stabilized, not dramatically, but steadily. The clinic adjusted her medication again, and this time the improvement held. She laughed more, coughed less, complained loudly when she felt strong enough to do so. "That's how you know I'm getting better," she told Daniel one afternoon. "I'm irritated again." "I'll take irritation over fear any day," he replied. Annie started after-school art classes twice a week. Miss Carter walked her there, stayed long enough to make sure she settled in, then left her to paint and draw with other children who didn't know her story and didn't ask. The first time Daniel picked her up afterward, Annie ran to him holding a piece of paper. "I made this," she said, breathless. It was a drawing of 3 figures holding hands. One tall, one small, one bent but steady. No faces, just outlines. "That's us," Annie said simply. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. "It's beautiful." That night, he received another call, not anonymous this time. "Daniel," said the voice on the other end, familiar now. "You're still refusing to disengage." "Yes," Daniel replied. "You're creating an unnecessary complication," the voice continued. "This child has drawn lines around you." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "I didn't draw those lines. I respected them." You're naive if you think this ends well. Daniel's voice remained calm. I'm realistic enough to know how it ends if I leave. A pause. You're not her father. No, Daniel said. I'm not. Then remember your place. Daniel opened his eyes. My place is where I stand. He ended the call. The next week brought the hardest moment yet. Ruth collapsed in the kitchen just after noon. Annie heard the sound before she understood it, the dull thud of a body meeting floor, the sharp intake of breath that followed. She ran in, heart pounding, and dropped to her knees beside her grandmother. Grandma, she whispered. Grandma, stay awake. Ruth tried to speak but couldn't. Her eyes fluttered. Annie did exactly what she'd been taught. She grabbed the phone, dialed, spoke clearly, answered questions without panic. When Daniel arrived minutes later, breathless and pale, the paramedics were already there. At the hospital, time lost its meaning. Daniel sat with Annie in a plastic chair, holding her hand while machines beeped and nurses moved with practiced urgency behind closed doors. Annie didn't cry. She didn't fidget. She stared straight ahead, jaw set, eyes bright with unshed tears. She's strong, Daniel said quietly. I know, Annie replied. But strong people get tired too. Hours later, a doctor came out. She'll be okay, he said. It was a complication, but we caught it in time. Annie sagged against Daniel, relief breaking through her control at last. He held her as she cried, small shoulders shaking, the weight she'd been carrying spilling out in silence. When Ruth woke later that evening, groggy but alive, the first thing she said was, "Did Annie call it in?" "Yes," Daniel replied. "She did everything right. It is another." Ruth reached for Annie's hand. "I knew you would." Annie wiped her eyes. "You scared me." Ruth smiled weakly. "Good. Means you care." Daniel stayed at the hospital all night. By morning, the story had shifted. Hospital administrators asked questions. Social workers reviewed files. Notes were made. Observations logged. And again, the familiar edge returned. A woman in a gray blazer introduced herself to Daniel mid-morning. "There's concern," she said gently, the way people always said that word, about the child's emotional burden. Daniel felt his patience thin. "She saved her grandmother's life." "Yes," the woman said. "And that's exactly the concern." Ruth overheard from the bed. "Don't you dare," she rasped. "Don't you dare turn her strength into pathology." The woman hesitated. "We're just trying to ensure." "Ensure what?" Ruth snapped. "That she learns helplessness? That she waits quietly while people fall apart around her?" Silence filled the room. Daniel spoke then, voice low but unyielding. "Annie has support. Documented. Consistent. She is not alone. And she is not exploited. She is loved." The woman glanced at her clipboard, then nodded stiffly. "We'll note that." After she left, Ruth closed her eyes. "They don't like children who can name the truth," she murmured, "especially when the truth makes adults uncomfortable." Daniel looked at Annie, sitting quietly by the window, watching snow melt into slush on the street below. "They won't make her small," he said. Ruth opened her eyes and met his. "No, but they'll try." That night, Daniel walked out of the hospital into cold air that burned his lungs. He stood there for a moment, steadying himself. This had crossed another line. What began as help had become defense. What began as defense had become commitment. And commitment demanded something deeper now. When he returned to the apartment days later, after Ruth was discharged and settled back into her bed, Annie met him at the door. "You stayed," she said. "Yes," Daniel replied, "even when it got scary." "Yes," Annie nodded, absorbing that. "Grandma says some people only love when it's easy," she said. "Others love when it costs something." Daniel knelt in front of her. "Which do you think matters more?" She didn't hesitate. "The second one." Daniel smiled, though his eyes burned. Outside, winter began to loosen its grip, just barely. Snow melted into water, water into movement. Nothing disappeared. It only changed form. And Daniel understood now that the world would keep testing this bond again and again. But Annie had already learned something most adults never did. That love, real love, was not proven by words or comfort. It was proven by who stayed when the ground gave way. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces, warmer mornings followed by stubborn cold. rain that smelled faintly of earth, the slow return of color to trees that had looked dead for months. Annie noticed every change. She always did. "Look," she said one afternoon, pointing to a small green bud pushing through the soil near the front steps. It didn't give up. Ruth smiled from her chair, a blanket tucked around her legs. "Neither did you." Their Valerie. Life settled into a new rhythm after the hospital scare, one shaped by caution but no longer ruled by fear. Ruth's recovery was slow but steady. She complained about the blandness of hospital-recommended diets and insisted on seasoning her soup anyway. Annie supervised, serious and vigilant, but no longer panicked at every cough. Daniel came by less often during workdays, more on weekends. Not because he cared less, but because staying meant finding balance. He'd learned that presence lost its meaning if it turned into control. One Saturday morning, Annie met him at the door with a question she'd clearly been saving. "Do you think I'm different?" she asked. Daniel paused. "Different how?" "From other kids," Annie said. "They don't do the things I do." Daniel considered this carefully. "You've had to learn things early. That makes you experienced, not broken." Annie frowned. "Some kids at school said I act like a grown-up. It's 7 desire." "And how did that make you feel?" Daniel asked. She thought about it. "Like they don't know what it's like to need to be one." Daniel nodded. "That's true, but I don't want to always be like that." Annie added quietly. "You won't be," he said. "You'll be many things." That seemed to ease something in her. The outside world, however, was less flexible. Daniel's name began appearing in places he hadn't intended. Not headlines, not accusations, just mentions. Boardroom whispers, invitations that quietly disappeared, conversations that ended a little sooner than they used to. He noticed. He accepted it. Pressure, when sustained long enough, always asked the same question. Is this worth it? One evening, Daniel received an email marked confidential. It outlined a proposal, an opportunity that would require him to distance himself from certain non-essential personal entanglements, to avoid complications. He read it once, then he closed the file. That night, he went to the apartment without calling ahead. Ruth was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables slowly, stubbornly. Annie sat at the table, reading aloud from a book. "Hey," Annie said, looking up. "You're early." "I needed to be," Daniel replied. Ruth glanced at his face. "Something happened." "Yes." "Bad?" she asked. "Clarifying," Daniel said. They sat together after dinner, the air heavy but not hostile. "They're making it clear," Daniel said finally. "That staying involved will cost me more." Ruth folded her hands. "And you're telling us because?" "Because this affects you," he replied. "If I step back now, the pressure may ease. For everyone." Annie stopped reading. Ruth didn't speak right away. When she did, her voice was steady. "Are you asking permission to leave?" Daniel met her eyes. "I'm asking whether my staying helps or hurts." Ruth leaned back, studying the ceiling. "I spent my life teaching Annie one thing," she said, "that people leave for reasons that make sense to them." Annie's fingers tightened around her book. "But," Ruth continued, "I also taught her that some people stay because leaving would cost them more than they're willing to pay." She looked at Daniel. "Only you can decide which one you are." Silence stretched. Annie finally spoke. "If you leave, I'll understand," she said, voice small but firm. "I'll be sad, but I'll understand." Daniel felt that land deeper than any threat. "I don't want you to understand that," he said quietly. "I want you to know something else is possible." Ruth nodded. "Then act like it." The next weeks tested that resolve. A reporter called, fishing gently, politely. Daniel declined. A city official requested a private conversation. Daniel attended, listened, and left without agreeing to anything. The message was clear. Alignment had a price. Independence had consequences. Daniel chose consequences. One afternoon, as Annie walked home from school with Miss Carter, a car slowed beside them. Not aggressively. Not obviously. Daniel's security noticed. That was the moment everything sharpened. He increased protection not visible, not dramatic, but undeniable. Ruth noticed the shift immediately. "This is what I didn't want," she said one night. "The sense that danger follows us." Daniel nodded. "I know. And yet," Ruth added, "I don't want you to go." Annie sat quietly between them. "I'm not going," Daniel said. "But we need to be honest," Ruth said. "This is bigger now. Bigger than kindness. Bigger than good intentions." "Yes," Daniel agreed. "It's about drawing a line." Annie looked up. "What kind of line?" "The kind that says some things aren't for sale," Daniel replied. Spring deepened. Trees bloomed. The city softened around the edges, pretending winter had never happened. At school, Annie was asked to write an essay titled, "Someone Who Changed My Life." She wrote about her grandmother first. Then, without hesitation, she wrote about Daniel. Not as a hero, not as a savior, as someone who stayed. When the teacher called Ruth to talk about it, Ruth cried quietly after hanging up. She didn't write about money, Ruth said to Daniel later, or safety, or help. "What did she write about?" Daniel asked. "Consistency," Ruth replied. "She wrote that it's easier to be brave when someone stands still beside you." "Is oxes." Daniel felt something close to pain and pride twist together in his chest. That night, he stood alone on the fire escape, looking out over the city. He understood now that what he'd stepped into could not be resolved cleanly. There would be no final victory, no neat ending, only ongoing choice. Stay, protect, absorb the cost, or step back and let the world revert to its defaults. Daniel already knew what he would do, but he also knew the next chapter would demand more than resolve. It would demand action. The line was crossed on a Tuesday. It wasn't dramatic. No sirens, no raised voices. Just a thin envelope slipped under the apartment door sometime between midnight and dawn. Ruth found it first. She stood in the hallway holding it with 2 fingers, as if paper alone could be contagious. Annie was still asleep. Daniel arrived 20 minutes later, summoned by a single sentence Ruth had spoken into the phone. "They've stopped asking." Daniel understood immediately. The envelope contained no letterhead, no official seal, just a typed page and a single photograph. The page read, "This situation has become inefficient." The photograph showed Annie walking home from school, Miss Carter half a step behind her, both of them caught mid-stride. The angle was wrong, too close, too intentional. Ruth sat down slowly. They followed her. Daniel's jaw tightened. They watched her. "That's worse," Ruth said. Daniel didn't disagree. Annie woke to an apartment that felt different. Quieter, but not peaceful. She took one look at their faces and stopped. "What happened?" she asked. Ruth hesitated. Daniel knelt in front of her. "Someone made a bad choice," he said carefully. "And now we need to make sure you're extra safe for a while." Annie studied his face. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," Daniel said immediately. "This has nothing to do with you doing anything wrong." She looked at the photograph on the table anyway. Recognition flickered. "They took my picture," she said softly. "Yes," Daniel replied. "And that wasn't okay." Annie nodded once. No tears, no panic, just understanding that landed too early for a child her age. "What happens now?" she asked. Daniel stood. "Now I stop being polite." The next 48 hours moved fast. Daniel pulled resources he'd never used for personal reasons. Not to intimidate, not to retaliate, but to clarify boundaries. Surveillance was traced. The photographer identified. The chain of instruction exposed just enough to make a point. Ruth watched it unfold from the sidelines, uneasy, but resolute. "This is escalation," she said one night. "Yes," Daniel replied. "But not ours." "You sure about that?" she asked. Daniel met her gaze. "They wanted silence. I'm giving them light." Est. Annie stayed with a trusted family friend for 2 nights. A woman Ruth had known since church days long ago. Annie packed her backpack carefully, bringing books, pajamas, and the drawing she'd made months ago. "Just in case," she said. Daniel drove her there himself. The car ride was quiet until Annie spoke. "You're angry," she said. "Yes," Daniel replied honestly. "Are you angry like when grown-ups yell?" she asked. "No," he said. "I'm angry like when something precious is threatened. She nodded. That's the kind of angry grandma understands. The meeting came on Friday. No invitations, no intermediaries, just a location and a time delivered through channels that had suddenly become very cooperative. Daniel arrived alone. The room was spare, neutral, designed to feel temporary. Two men waited inside, both older, both practiced at appearing reasonable. This has gone far enough, one of them began. Daniel didn't sit. You involved a child, and, crazed, we documented a situation, the other said smoothly. You stalked a 6-year-old, Daniel replied. Call it what it is. Silence followed. You're forcing our hand, the first man said. Daniel leaned forward slightly. No, you forced mine. He laid out the information calmly. Names, dates, patterns. The fact that everything they'd done was already known in places they did not control. I will not negotiate Annie's safety, Daniel continued. You don't get to test how much pressure it takes for me to disappear. And what if we don't back down? The second man asked. Daniel straightened. Then you become the example. They looked at him differently then. Not impressed, not frightened, measured. The meeting ended without agreement, which, Daniel knew, was a kind of victory. That evening, Annie came home. She ran into the apartment, backpack bouncing, relief visible in every movement. Ruth held her for a long time, breathing her in like oxygen. Daniel stood back, watching. Are they gone? Annie asked. For now, Daniel said. Annie considered this. For now is okay. Later, after Annie was asleep, Ruth poured tea with shaking hands. You crossed into something dangerous today, she said. Yes, Daniel replied. And you'd do it again. Yes. Ruth looked at him steadily. Then we need to talk about the future. Daniel nodded. I agree. I am Fraise. They spoke late into the night. About guardianship. About contingencies no one ever wanted to consider. About what would happen if Ruth's health failed suddenly. About what Annie would need if the world tried again to shrink her. This isn't about ownership, Ruth said firmly. It's about continuity. I understand, Daniel replied. Ruth reached into a drawer and pulled out a folded document. Old. Worn. I started this months ago, she said. I didn't know how to finish it. Ozer. Daniel took the paper carefully. He didn't open it yet. You don't have to decide tonight, Ruth added. But you should know where I stand. Daniel finally looked at the document. It named him. He closed his eyes briefly. Thank you, he said quietly. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the small, decisive shift that had just taken place inside a modest apartment. The next morning, Annie woke early and found Daniel in the kitchen. You didn't leave, she said. No, he replied. She smiled, small but certain. Good. Daniel watched her eat breakfast, swing her legs, hum softly to herself. He knew now that there would be no returning to a simpler version of this story. There would only be the work of protecting what mattered and accepting the cost. And somewhere deep inside, he understood something else. This was no longer about standing beside a child. It was about standing in front of her. The paperwork took longer than Daniel expected. Not because of legal complexity, he had teams who lived for that, but because Ruth insisted on understanding every line. She sat at the small kitchen table with reading glasses perched on her nose, moving slowly, deliberately, refusing to be rushed. I've signed too many things in my life without reading them, she said. I won't do that again. Daniel respected that. He answered questions patiently, translating legal language into plain truth. Annie listened from the floor, coloring quietly but clearly paying attention. So this doesn't mean I stop being Annie's grandma, Ruth said at one point. No, Daniel replied. It means if something happens, Annie doesn't get lost in the system while people argue. Ruth nodded. And it doesn't mean she has to live with you. No, Daniel said again. It means she has options. Ruth glanced at Annie. You hear that? Annie looked up. Options are good, she said. Options mean you don't get stuck. Ruth smiled faintly. You've always been too smart. The documents were finalized 2 weeks later. Nothing dramatic changed on the surface. Annie still went to school. Ruth still complained about her medication. Daniel still split his time between meetings in the apartment. But underneath, something had settled. Certainty. The pressure didn't stop. It adjusted. Daniel noticed men who looked a little too long in public places. He noticed questions that circled instead of landing, invitations that came with unspoken conditions. He declined them all. What surprised him was how little he resented it. One evening, as he walked Annie home from a library program, she asked a question he hadn't expected. "Do you ever wish you were invisible?" she asked. Daniel thought about it. "I used to." "What changed?" she asked. "I realized invisibility protects you," he said. "But it doesn't protect anyone else." Annie nodded, considering that. "Being seen is scary." "Yes," Daniel agreed. "But sometimes it's necessary." Spring gave way to early summer. School let out. Annie grew restless in that way children do when routine disappears. Ruth's energy fluctuated. Better on some days, worse on others. Daniel adjusted again. He hired a tutor for Annie, not because she was behind, but because she was curious. He arranged for swimming lessons at a community center, insisting on low-key, public settings. "You don't need to live like you're hiding," he told Ruth. "You just need to be aware." Awareness became habit. Then came the request Daniel had been expecting. A meeting, not hostile, not friendly, framed as reconciliation. Daniel considered it carefully before agreeing. Ruth was direct when he told her. "If this is a trap, it won't be," Daniel said. "Not like before. And Annie? She won't be anywhere near it." Ruth nodded. "Then go. But remember, people who smile while they threaten are still threatening." Daniel smiled faintly. "I know." The meeting took place in a restaurant that specialized in appearing neutral. Private room, polite staff, carefully chosen silence. The woman from months ago was there again. So was a man Daniel hadn't met. Younger, sharper. "We're prepared to reset," the woman said after the pleasantries. "Mutual disengagement." Daniel leaned back. "Define that." You stop involving yourself in matters that draw attention," the man said, "and we ensure no further interference." Daniel shook his head. "That's not mutual. That's conditional." The woman sighed. "You've made a point. Everyone sees it." "That wasn't the goal," Daniel replied. "Then what is?" the man asked. Daniel looked at him steadily. "That a child isn't currency." Silence. "You're forcing us to acknowledge something we don't operate on," the woman said quietly. "Then adapt," Daniel replied. "Or move aside." The man's jaw tightened. "You're not as untouchable as you think." Daniel stood. "I'm not trying to be untouchable. I'm trying to be clear." He left without waiting for permission. That night, he walked into the apartment to find Annie sprawled on the floor, surrounded by paper and markers. "What's this?" he asked. "My list," Annie said, not looking up. "Of what?" "Things I want to be," she replied. Daniel sat beside her. "That's a long list." She nodded. "I don't want to pick just one." He scanned the page. Teacher, doctor, artist, protector, listener. "Protector?" he asked gently. Annie shrugged. "Someone has to notice when things aren't fair." Daniel felt something shift again. Ruth watched from her chair. "She's been like this since the hospital," she said. "Asking big questions." Daniel nodded. "Big experiences do that." Annie looked up. "Do you think fairness is real?" Daniel thought carefully. "I think fairness is something people build when they refuse to accept cruelty as normal." Annie considered this. "Then it's work." "Yes," Daniel said. "It is." That night, Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his own apartment. He thought about how his life had narrowed and deepened at the same time, how some doors had closed quietly, while others had opened into responsibility he couldn't have imagined before. He didn't regret it. He thought about Annie growing older, about the questions she would ask at 12, at 16, at 20. About the day she would see the world clearly enough to judge his choices. He hoped she would see that he stayed, not because it was easy, not because it made him feel powerful, but because some moments asked you to decide who you were and then live with the answer. In the morning, Daniel received a short message. "We understand your position." He deleted it without replying. When he arrived at the apartment later that day, Annie ran to him with a grin. "I learned how to float today," she announced. "That's impressive," Daniel said. "It's about trusting the water," she explained seriously. "You don't fight it. You just stay calm. Daniel smiled, recognizing the metaphor immediately. Yes, he said, exactly like that. As summer settled in, the sense of immediate danger faded, but the vigilance remained. Not fear-based, purpose-based. Daniel knew the final challenges were still ahead, but he also knew something else now. Annie was no longer just someone he protected. She was someone who would one day protect others, and that made every cost worthwhile. The first real test came quietly. No envelopes, no phone calls, no strangers watching from across the street. Just an absence Daniel had learned not to trust. Summer moved forward anyway. Annie turned 7 in June. Ruth insisted on baking a cake herself, even though it took most of the day and nearly all her energy. The cake leaned slightly to one side, the frosting uneven, but Annie declared it perfect. I like things that look like they were made by people, she said. They celebrated in the small apartment with a few neighbors, Miss Carter, and one of Ruth's old church friends who brought a folding chair and too many balloons. Daniel stayed in the background, watching Annie laugh, watching Ruth's eyes shine with something dangerously close to peace. For a moment, it almost felt earned. That illusion didn't last. 3 days later, Daniel received a call from a number he recognized immediately. You should turn on the news, the voice said, calm and distant. Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. He turned on the television. The story was framed carefully. Concerned citizens, questions of influence, an unnamed businessman inserting himself into a vulnerable family situation. No accusations, just doubt, the kind that spread. Daniel turned the TV off before the segment ended. By the afternoon, messages began arriving. Board members, partners, old allies who spoke carefully, as if choosing words from a shrinking list. You might want to clarify. This is becoming visible. Is there something you should tell us? Daniel answered none of them. Instead, he went to the apartment. Ruth was already aware. Someone had knocked earlier. A journalist. Polite but persistent. Annie had been at swimming lessons. They didn't push, Ruth said. Not yet. Daniel nodded. They want reaction. Well, Ruth said dryly. They won't get panic. Annie returned an hour later, hair still damp, cheeks flushed. Why was my name on the TV? She asked. Daniel felt the question settle heavily in the room. Because sometimes, he said carefully, people talk about things they don't understand. Did I do something wrong? Annie asked. Ruth spoke before Daniel could. No, baby, you didn't do anything but exist. Annie frowned. That seems like a lot of trouble for just existing. Daniel almost smiled. Almost. That night, Daniel made a decision he had delayed for months. He went public, not loudly, not defensively. He issued a single statement. No names, no explanations of power or wealth, just clarity. He spoke about responsibility, about consent, about choosing to stand with a family at their request, not for gain, not for image. He refused to dramatize Annie's life. He refused to explain Ruth's health. He refused to apologize. He ended with one sentence. Children are not leverage, and care is not a crime. The reaction was immediate. Some support, some backlash, some silence from places that used to answer his calls on the first ring. Daniel expected all of it. What he didn't expect was the call from Annie's school. The principal's voice was cautious. We've had some inquiries. Daniel closed his eyes. And we handled them, the principal continued. Annie is safe here. She's loved here. I wanted you to know that. Oh, Daniel exhaled slowly. Thank you. When he told Ruth, she sat back, exhausted but relieved. They're not all blind, she said. No, Daniel agreed, just loud. The real confrontation came a week later. A meeting was requested, formal this time, with documentation, with lawyers present on both sides. Ruth insisted on attending. I won't have people talking about my granddaughter like she's a theory, she said. They can say it to my face. Take you one. The room was larger than the others had been. More witnesses. More careful language. Concerns were raised. Reassurances offered. Subtle suggestions made. Daniel listened. Ruth did not. You want to know what's best for Annie? She said finally, voice thin but steady. What's best is that she knows the adults in her life don't disappear when things get uncomfortable. The room shifted. One man cleared his throat. "This isn't about discomfort." Ruth leaned forward. "Then why are you so uneasy?" Silence. Annie was not present, but her presence filled the room anyway. Daniel spoke last. "If your concern is her well-being," he said, "then judge outcomes, not optics." The meeting ended without resolution, which meant it wasn't over. That night, Annie sat with Daniel on the fire escape. Legs dangling, the city humming below. "Are they trying to make you leave?" she asked quietly. Daniel didn't lie. "Will you?" she asked. Daniel looked at her, really looked at her. The child who had asked for a ride home and somehow changed the direction of his life. "No," he said. Annie nodded, as if she'd known the answer already. "Grandma says people tell you who they are when it costs them something," she said. Daniel smiled softly. "Your grandma is very wise." Annie leaned her head against his arm. "If they make things hard, you can still stay, right?" "Yes," Daniel said. "Hard doesn't scare me." She smiled then, a small, fierce smile. "Good," she said, "because I don't want to grow up thinking the world always wins." Daniel felt something settle into place at those words. The next morning, he received another message. This one was different. "We are withdrawing." No explanation, no apology, just withdrawal. Daniel read it once and handed his phone to Ruth. She read it, then handed it back. "Don't trust it," she said. "I don't," Daniel replied. "But I accept it." Yes. The story faded from the news cycle within days. Something else replaced it. Something louder, something easier. Life resumed, altered but intact. Annie started summer camp. Ruth planted herbs on the windowsill. Daniel returned to work with a narrower circle and a clearer conscience. One evening, Annie asked a final question that summer. "Do you think this is the end?" she asked. Daniel thought about it, about the quiet threats, the visible lines, the choices that had closed some doors forever. "No," he said, "but I think it's a turning point." She nodded. "Turning points are okay." "Yes," Daniel agreed. "They are." As night settled over the city, Daniel stood at the window of the apartment, watching lights flicker on one by one. He knew the last chapter was coming. Not because the danger was gone, but because the shape of their future had finally revealed itself. Not perfect, not safe, but chosen. The rain came back the way it always did in the city, without permission, without warning, and without concern for who had already endured enough. Annie noticed it first. She stood by the window of the apartment, now familiar in every creak and shadow, watching water bead and slide down the glass. "It sounds different tonight," she said. Daniel, standing behind her, listened. The rain was heavier, slower, not frantic like that first night years ago. This rain felt deliberate. "Yeah," he said, "it does." Ruth sat in her chair, wrapped in a light sweater despite the summer air. Her breathing was slower these days, more measured. Age and illness had not left her, but neither had they won. "I always thought rain meant something was about to change," Ruth said. "Good or bad. You never knew which until afterward." Daniel smiled faintly. "I think that's still true." Annie turned from the window. "Is this one good or bad?" Ruth reached for her hand. "It's honest. That's better than either." Life, after the withdrawal, didn't become easier. It became clearer. Daniel no longer pretended his world and Annie's were separate. He stopped trying to balance appearances and started prioritizing alignment. Some partnerships dissolved quietly. Others strengthened in unexpected ways. People who valued comfort drifted away. People who valued integrity stayed. That was the cost. And the gift. Annie grew in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. She laughed more easily now, but she also listened with depth that startled adults. She noticed when people talked down to her. She noticed when kindness came with strings attached. She learned to say no. One afternoon, walking home from the corner store with Daniel, she asked, "Do you think people are born good or bad?" Daniel considered the question carefully. "I think people are born unfinished." Annie nodded. "That makes sense. You don't blame a house for missing walls if it's still being built." Daniel smiled. "Exactly." Ruth's health declined slowly. Not tragically, but inevitably. The doctors were honest. There were no emergencies now, just time. One evening, as the light faded from the room, Ruth asked Daniel to sit with her alone. "You know I won't be here forever," she said plainly. "Yes," Daniel replied. "And you know Annie will be," Ruth continued. "Yes." "Oh." Ruth reached out, gripping his hand with surprising strength. "Promise me something." Daniel leaned in. "Anything. Promise me you won't try to turn her into a symbol," Ruth said. "Or a mission. Or proof of anything." Daniel swallowed. "I promise." "She's a person," Ruth said. "Not a lesson." "I know," Daniel said. "She's always been." Ruth smiled, eyes closing briefly. "Good. Then I can rest." That night, Annie climbed into Ruth's bed and fell asleep beside her, one small hand wrapped around an older one. Daniel watched from the doorway, understanding that some moments did not belong to him, even if he was part of the story. Weeks later, Ruth passed quietly in her sleep. No alarms, no panic, just an ending that came gently, like a tide pulling back. Annie cried in Daniel's arms, deep, honest sobs that shook her whole body. He did not tell her to be strong. He did not tell her everything would be okay. He stayed. The days that followed were heavy, but not chaotic. Arrangements were made. Papers finalized. Annie asked questions and received real answers. "Where do people go?" she asked one night. Daniel answered truthfully. "Wherever the people they loved carry them." She nodded. "Then Grandma's still here?" "Yes," Daniel said. "She is." The apartment changed after that. Ruth's chair remained, but empty. The kitchen felt quieter. Annie moved through the space carefully at first, then more freely, as if learning a new map. Daniel did not rush anything. When the time came, Annie moved into Daniel's home. Not because she had to, but because she chose to. On her first night there, she walked through the room slowly. "It's big," she said. "Yes," Daniel replied. "It doesn't feel lonely," she added. "That's because you're here," he said. She smiled, small and certain. The world did not stop watching them. It never would. But the watching changed. Curiosity replaced suspicion. Respect replaced doubt. Not because Daniel demanded it, but because Annie grew into herself without apology. Years passed. Annie learned to argue without raising her voice. She learned that justice was not loud but persistent. She learned that loyalty did not mean silence in the face of harm. Daniel learned to listen more than he spoke. He learned that protection did not mean control. He learned that love, real love, expanded responsibility instead of shrinking freedom. On a rainy evening years later, Annie stood by the window again. Taller now, sharper. Her eyes still observant but softer around the edges. "Do you remember the night we met?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "Every detail." "I was scared," she said. "But I wasn't lost." "Not really." Daniel looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I knew where home was," she said. "I just needed someone to help me get there." Weak. Daniel felt the weight of the years settle into something like peace. "You did the rest," he said. Annie smiled. "We did." Outside, the rain continued to fall, steady and unremarkable, like life itself. Daniel watched the city lights reflect in the wet streets and thought about how one moment, one decision, one refusal to look away, had reshaped everything, not into something perfect, but into something true. And that, he knew now, was enough. Because some questions changed lives not by how they were answered, but by who chose to answer them. "Sir, can you take me home?" He had, and in doing so, he found his own. The story reminds us that real justice is often quiet and deeply personal. It does not always come from systems, wealth, or power, but from an ordinary human decision to stand in front of someone who is vulnerable and refuse to step aside. It teaches that kindness is not weakness, that protecting a child is not charity but responsibility, and that doing the right thing often costs comfort, reputation, or safety. Most of all, the story shows that loyalty is proven by who stays when fear, pressure, and inconvenience appear, and that one moment of courage can change not only a child's life, but the soul of the person who chooses to answer instead of looking away. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.